Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to another session of our Pastor's Drop-In Bible Study video. And we're continuing today going through the Beatitudes. And just like normal, we'll start with a moment of looking at the Beatitude as it's written in our modern English translation. You'll have a chance to pause and mull over and think through what Jesus is saying in that Beatitude, in the understanding the words and phrases sense. Of course, you'll have opportunity after the video to think about what it means to you, what God is saying to you through the verse. But at first, we're just looking at what does it mean, understanding the words and phrases. And then after that, we'll go through my retranslation of the Beatitude. And as always, we've got the English translation that I've written up here, pulled out all the definitions of the Greek words that Jesus used, and then rephrased it in my retranslation and my paraphrase of it. And with that, we'll go through it once briefly just to get the whole picture, and then we'll come back and pull it apart phrase by phrase. Now, one different thing today is I don't have a video or book recommendation for you. I'm sorry, but the content of this beatitude is so important and so deep and central to the Christian gospel that I just don't have time to pull in a video recommendation and keep this video nice and short and sweet and to the point. So our beatitude today is, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Now think about that a moment. Blessed are the pure in heart. What is purity? What is purity of heart? For they shall see God. In what way shall they see God? How do they see God? So take a moment and mull that over. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And pause the movie, our video here, try to understand it a little bit more deeply. And when you come back, we'll go through my retranslation. All right, so now we'll move over to our handy-dandy Fellowship Hall whiteboard and go through this once quickly and then a second time pulling out all the bits and pieces and all the nuance that Jesus had in the original Greek. So our retranslation reads, "Those whose core person and character have been and are being made morally clean and guiltless by God are favored by him, because by means of this cleansing, they are progressively enabled both to notice God and see him face to face." Now that's a lot of content to pull out of so small a phrase as "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." But if we pause and look through each one of these words and phrases, we'll see how all of this, especially in light of the gospel as a whole, of the rule of faith that has been passed down to us from Christ through the apostles and on through the centuries, we'll see how all of this content is encapsulated in Jesus' very brief, very succinct words. So the first major concept we have to look at is heart. And the phrase we use here is core person and character. Now, just like in English, we'll use heart symbolically to mean our emotions, our love, our passion. The Greeks used it symbolically too, but for them it wasn't just emotion, though that was part of it, but also our intellect, our mind, our memory, our will, our moral character. Our entire interior person and soul was encapsulated by them symbolically in the word heart. So when Jesus is speaking of the pure in heart, he's speaking of this full symbolic understanding. Hence, we've rephrased it, core person, our personality, our thoughts, our memories, and character, our will, how we choose to act, how we choose to behave. But then we also have, in Jesus' words, the phrase pure of heart. So what is this purity? What is this pureness of heart that Jesus is talking about? Well, we've rephrased that here as have been and are being made morally clean and guiltless by God. Now, two parts of this, the morally clean and guiltless parts, are pretty clearly inherent in purifying, in cleansing, and making something clean. But where did the rest of this come from? The rest of it comes from Jesus' full message of the gospel, where it's not that we are vigorously scrubbing at our souls and trying to purify ourselves, make ourselves good enough for God. No, it's that we are saved. We are brought into relationship with God. We are purified by God's grace through our faith in Jesus Christ, lived out and responded to by joining in the fellowship of his body, the church, through the sacrament of baptism, through confirmation, and then into the ongoing life of the church. That wider gospel narrative that the Beatitudes are wrapped in contains both the have been and are being sense. It's a progressive, ongoing walk of faith with God. And that the cleansing, the morally cleaning and guiltlessness element is given to us by God and not by ourselves. Now, after this, we get blessed, which, as we've seen many times before now, just means are favored by God. So the pure in heart, those whose core person and character have been purified by God and are being in the process of being purified by God, are blessed, are favored by God. Why? Because by means of this cleansing, they are progressively enabled both to notice God and see him face to face. That's a lot of content to pull out of somewhere, so where did that come from? It comes from the word Jesus used to see. And this word has a wide range of meaning. It can go from barely noticing something, like out of the corner of your eye, all the way through to full-on, face-to-face, clear, direct seeing and communication, and everything in between. So when Jesus is saying, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," in light of the ongoing nature of salvation and the walk of faith, we're enabled first to see God, and then more and more and more to see him in his fullness, to move from noticing to face-to-face communication. Now, what does all of this mean? We've got the words and phrases down, but what is the message Jesus is conveying here? The message is the fullness of the gospel, of how we go from not being Christian at all, to hearing the gospel, to growing in our understanding, to the point of having faith in God, and then living that faith out the rest of our lives, and then on into eternity. And in the church, particularly in the Methodist tradition, but it's common to everybody, there are 3 points, 3 sort of senses or phases of how we receive God's grace and how we are enabled to respond to him through that grace and move from noticing him to seeing him face to face. Now, each of these 3 types of grace have a sort of long name. Deep breath, I promise. We'll walk through them very, very slowly. And you'll notice as we do that they contain words and elements that you already know from places that aren't within the church. These aren't, for the most part, specifically churchy words. So, in that spirit, the first sense of God's grace that is given to us, the first form of grace, is what's called prevenient grace. Weird word, prevenient. But if you pause and pull it apart, it's actually 2 words, pre and via. Now, pre simply means before. You all know that word, pre-school, pre-view, all of these different pre things. And via just means way. I'm going to the store via Menominee Avenue. So you know that word as well. So this pre-via grace, this before going grace, simply means the grace that God gives us before we begin our walk of faith. And as such, it's common to everybody, to Christians, to non-Christians, to atheists, to Buddhists, to Shintos, to pagans. Everybody receives this grace. And this grace allows us to do two things. First, to notice God at all. Because God, being perfect and perfectly good and perfectly loving, is not something we encounter all that often. We have adequate things, an adequate whiteboard, an adequate computer. But it's not perfect. You can still see the reflection on the whiteboard of the lights. Computers can stall and update at the worst possible times. It's useful, it's functional, it's good in that sense, but it's not perfect. God's perfection is so entirely other from anything else we experience that we need a certain amount of grace to enable us to even notice it in any way that impacts us. And then the second part of prevenient grace is that it's the grace that gives us and preserves for us our free will. It enables us, once we've seen God out of the corner of our eye, once we've noticed him, to choose either to begin turning towards God or not to. We are not robots. We're not programmed to do A, then B, then C, then D mechanically. God wants a living, loving relationship with us, which means that we have to be able to choose to be in relationship with him, to turn towards him, or not. So as we turn towards God, as we begin noticing God, we learn more about the faith, we read the Bible, we hear the gospel, and eventually we move to the place where we're in line with God. And we take that first step along the straight and narrow path. Now that lining up and first step of faith is what's called justifying grace. Now, justifying, another big word. But imagine, if you will, opening up a Microsoft Word document. And across the top of the screen, you've got all your toolbars. And in those tools, there are a number of buttons. The first is justify left. Put all the words in line on the left side of the page. Then justify center, line everything up from the middle. And then justify right, move everything to the right side of the page. Or justify both sides, which pulls everything so it lines up on both ends. And those justifying buttons, those justifying functions, are exactly what we just talked about. It's lining up. In that sense, it's lining up words on a page. In the sense of grace, it's our being lined up with God, being able to look at God. And so that's the second sense of grace. And then the third is what's called sanctifying grace. And sanctify simply means to make holy or to be saintly. I mean, you've all heard the more Latino and Hispanic names for people and cities and things. San Francisco, San Diego. That San is the same root word, sanctus, saint. So sanctifying grace is saint-making grace. It's that grace that allows us, once we're in line with God and have taken that first step, it allows us to see and understand God a little bit more, to, by means of that grace, by means of that understanding God has given us, to evaluate our lives, to see where we do and don't line up with God's expectations and God's character, change ourselves, and by that change take another step closer to God. We get a better picture. We're a little bit closer. We're able to reevaluate again by God's grace and take another step as we bring ourselves more and more in line with Christ, as we grow more and more Christ-like. And that is the fullness of the Christian life, what it means to be a Christian. It's sort of almost like the power symbol that you see on your computer. You start with Prevenient Grace, which allows you to notice God. Then you move down through to Justifying Grace, that first step. And then it's a circle after that, an ongoing circle. We see God, we notice things about him, we learn about him, we're in relationship with him. And out of that relationship and grace, we're able to then move to evaluating ourselves. How are we like or not like God? And when we notice ways that we're not like Christ, or we're not like God, we change our behavior, we become more like him, and move closer towards him into deeper relationship with him, where we see more, come, reevaluate ourselves, and then walk closer again. And on and on and on it goes. And that is what it means to be a Christian, is to be on this continual walk of deepening faith with Christ. And no matter how quickly you're going down this path, how slowly, how far or not you've gone, as long as you've been brought into line and are looking at Christ, looking at God, and are moving towards him, you're a Christian. If you're not moving towards him, you're not a Christian. And that's not necessarily a criticism. That's just what it means to be Christian, is to constantly grow in grace and Christ-likeness. And so what Jesus is saying here when he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," what he's saying is exactly what we see here, that our core person and character are constantly moving towards being made morally clean and guiltless, more Christ-like, and this by God's grace. And through this process, we are favored by God by being enabled to see him more and more clearly, thus being made more pure and seeing him better, and on it goes. So that's the message of this beatitude, and I hope it's been a blessing to you. Again, sorry I don't have a video or a book for you today, but we have one for the next session I'll be leading. And until then, I hope you have a blessed time. Goodbye.